Iceland, 9th century. Winter storms barrel across the volcanic wasteland with winds that can knock a grown man to his knees. Temperatures plummet to -15 degrees Fahrenheit. Snow drives sideways for months, burying everything in sight. When Norse settlers first arrived on these shores, they expected to build the same wooden halls they knew from Norway. But Iceland offered them something completely different, a treeless landscape where survival seemed impossible. Yet these Vikings didn't just survive the brutal Icelandic winters, they engineered one of the most sophisticated cold weather shelters ever created, using nothing but earth, stone, and a single long fire. This is how they built turf longhouses that could withstand the harshest conditions on Earth. Please share in the comments where you're watching from, and if you've ever experienced or learned any traditional survival skills yourself, we'd love to hear your wisdom. Subscribe for more ancient knowledge. When Norse longships first scraped against Iceland's black volcanic shores in the 800s, their passengers carried more than axes and silver. They brought the architectural memory of Norway's great timber halls, structures built from towering pine and oak that could house dozens of warriors beneath soaring wooden beams. But Iceland had other plans. Where they expected forests, the settlers found windswept plains of volcanic rock and scattered birch scrub barely tall enough to reach a man's waist. The howling Atlantic gales that had driven their ships westward now threatened to flatten any structure they might dare to build above ground. Within a generation, these Norse colonists had abandoned their dreams of recreating the timber halls of their homeland. Instead, they developed something far more ingenious, the turf longhouse, or Langhus as they called it in their native tongue. These weren't crude huts dug into hillsides like desperate cave dwellings. They were sophisticated engineering solutions that transformed Iceland's harsh landscape into the very materials of survival. The turf longhouse became an oblong sanctuary, slightly wider in its middle section, where entire extended families could weather months of Arctic darkness with their livestock, food stores, and precious tools all sheltered beneath a single living roof. The secret lay in understanding turf not as mere dirt, but as a building material more sophisticated than modern insulation. Norse builders developed what they called the Herringbone method, a technique for stacking thick blocks of sod that would make a medieval mason weep with envy. Each turf block, cut from the earth with roots and vegetation still intact, measured roughly 3 to 4 inches thick and could stretch a foot or more in length. These weren't simply piled like stones. They were laid in alternating diagonal courses within wooden frames, creating interlocking chevron patterns that resembled the spine of a massive fish. The genius of this herringbone pattern became apparent as the seasons passed. The living roots within each turf block began to weave together, stitching the entire wall into a single organic mat. What had started as individual pieces of earth gradually became a unified barrier that could shed rain like a duck's back, while sealing out the bitter winds that regularly reached hurricane force across the island. As the root systems intertwined and strengthened, the wall actually improved with age, becoming more windproof and waterproof with each passing year. But thickness was where these turf walls truly showed their engineering brilliance. In the milder regions of Iceland, walls might measure just over 3 feet thick. But in the most exposed locations, where winter storms could rage for weeks without pause, these earthen barriers could swell to nearly 6 feet in thickness. Imagine walls so massive that a grown man could stretch out his arms and still not span their width. These weren't just houses, they were thermal bunkers, designed to laugh at temperatures that regularly plunged to -15 degrees Fahrenheit and winds that could strip the hide from an unprotected animal. At the heart of each longhouse, running down its central spine like a river of warmth, lay the Langeld, the long fire that would become the beating heart of Norse survival in the New World. To the untrained eye, Iceland's landscape in the 9th century appeared as a builder's nightmare. Volcanic plains stretched to the horizon, broken only by glacial rivers and fields of black lava rock. No towering forests provided ready timber. No quarries offered dressed stone. Yet Norse settlers possessed a survival skill that modern builders have largely forgotten: the ability to read any landscape as a potential hardware store. Where others saw desolation, they identified three critical building materials that would define Icelandic architecture for the next 1,000 years. The first and most abundant resource was turf itself, but not just any patch of earth would suffice. Norse builders became connoisseurs of soil, seeking out locations where decades of grazing had created the perfect building material. They looked for areas where thick grasses had established deep fibrous root systems, often in old pasture land or along the edges of heath, where generations of sheep and cattle had compressed the earth into dense mats. The ideal turf contained what they recognized as nature's own reinforcement system: a tough network of grass roots that functioned like organic rebar, binding soil particles together with tensile strength that could resist cracking and settling. Cutting these turf blocks required both skill and timing. Workers wielded long knives and specialized spades, often tools passed down through families, to slice through the dense root mat. Each block had to be substantial enough to maintain its integrity when stacked, typically measuring 3 to 4 inches thick and stretching 12 to 18 inches in length. The weight of these sodden bricks could easily exceed 30 pounds each, making the cutting and transport of turf a community effort that demanded careful coordination. Timing proved equally critical. The best turf was cut in late spring or early summer, when the ground had dried sufficiently to provide firm cutting, but while the root systems remained active and strong enough to hold the blocks together during transport and construction. Stone provided the Longhouses' foundation and structural anchor. Norse settlers scoured riverbeds and lava fields for flat stones that could be fitted together into stable foundation walls and interior pavements. These weren't random rocks picked up from the ground. Successful builders developed an eye for stones with the right dimensions and weight distribution, understanding that a proper foundation had to resist both the enormous weight of thick turf walls and the relentless freeze-thaw cycles that could crack inferior stonework. The central hearth demanded particularly careful stone selection, as only certain types could withstand the thermal stress of a fire that might burn continuously for months. Perhaps most precious of all was timber, which arrived in Iceland through one of nature's most generous shipping services. Driftwood, carried by ocean currents from the forests of Siberia and northern Europe, washed up on Iceland's beaches in quantities that made the difference between survival and death. These weathered logs and planks, already seasoned by their oceanic journey, became the skeletal framework that would support both turf walls and living roofs. Every piece of driftwood was examined, sorted, and allocated with the care of a medieval treasurer dividing gold coins. The largest timbers became central posts and ridge beams, while smaller pieces were shaped into wall supports and roof rafters. The construction of a turf longhouse began with a decision that could mean the difference between life and death during Iceland's brutal winters. Master builders studied the landscape with the intensity of military strategists, searching for sites that offered natural protection from the prevailing winds while providing access to water and drainage. Once selected, they laid out an elongated rectangle that typically stretched 15 to 30 meters in length, deliberately orienting the structure so its long sides faced the direction of the most violent storms. This wasn't accidental. By presenting the narrowest profile to the wind, the gable ends bore the brunt of the assault, while the lengthy walls remained relatively protected from the crushing pressure that could collapse lesser structures. The foundation work required an understanding of physics that many modern builders would admire. Norse craftsmen began by laying flat stones into a continuous low wall that rose roughly to knee height, creating what amounted to a thermal break between the massive turf walls above and the cold, wet ground below. This stone curb served multiple purposes beyond simple elevation. It provided drainage channels that directed water away from the base of the turf walls, preventing the soggy conditions that could cause an entire wall to slump into ruin. More critically, it created a stable platform that could distribute the enormous weight of the turf walls without settling unevenly as the ground beneath froze and thawed through Iceland's dramatic seasonal cycles. The timber frame that rose from this stone foundation represented perhaps the most sophisticated element of longhouse engineering. Unlike modern construction where walls carry the roof load, Norse builders created what amounted to two independent structures. A series of central posts, often standing 8 to 10 feet tall, supported the ridge beam and rafters that would carry the roof loads. Meanwhile, a second set of wooden posts anchored against the interior faces of the stone foundation created the framework for the turf walls. This dual system meant that even if the heavy earthen walls shifted or settled over time, the roof structure remained stable and weatherproof. The herringbone turf laying technique that followed transformed raw earth into sophisticated insulation. Within the wooden wall frames, workers began stacking turf blocks in alternating diagonal courses that created interlocking chevron patterns running up the full height of the wall. Each course was laid at roughly a 45-degree angle to the one below, ensuring that no vertical seam could allow cold air to penetrate straight through the wall. The blocks overlapped their neighbours like enormous masonry units, spreading the structural loads across multiple contact points and preventing any single block from bearing excessive weight that might cause cracking or collapse. As the walls rose, builders often added second and even third layers of turf blocks, staggering the seams between layers so completely that no continuous gap could provide a pathway for heat loss. The finished walls, measuring anywhere from 3 to 6 feet in thickness, created thermal barriers so effective that the interior temperature could remain above freezing even when howling Arctic storms drove outside temperatures well below -15 degrees Fahrenheit. The roof construction that crowned this earthen fortress would prove equally ingenious, creating a living cap that protected the precious timber frame while adding yet another layer of insulation against Iceland's merciless climate. The Langeld was far more than a simple campfire stretched along the floor of the longhouse. This elongated hearth, running down the central spine of the structure like a river of controlled flame, represented one of the most sophisticated heating systems ever devised by medieval engineers. Where modern homes rely on complex ductwork and mechanical systems to distribute warmth, Norse builders created a single continuous fire that could heat air, stone, and human bodies with an efficiency that would impress contemporary thermal engineers. The Langeld typically extended 12 to 20 feet in length, contained within carefully fitted stone borders that channeled heat upward while protecting the surrounding wooden platforms from ignition. Beneath this long fire lay the true genius of the system, a raised stone pavement that functioned as a primitive radiant heating floor. Flat stones, selected for their ability to absorb and retain thermal energy, were fitted together to create a continuous surface that elevated the fire several inches above the earthen floor. As flames danced above this stone platform, the rocks beneath absorbed enormous quantities of heat, transforming each stone into a thermal battery that would continue radiating warmth long after the active flames had died to glowing embers. This thermal mass effect meant that a fire built in the evening could continue heating the longhouse throughout the frigid night, even when howling Arctic winds drove outside temperatures to -15 degrees Fahrenheit or lower. The management of smoke and fresh air within the longhouse revealed an understanding of atmospheric pressure and airflow that bordered on the scientific. Above the Langeld, builders incorporated a smoke hole or vent in the turf roof, sometimes covered with a movable panel made from stretched animal gut that could be adjusted based on wind conditions and weather. The physics of the system were elegantly simple. Warm air rising from the fire created a natural draft that that drew smoke upward and out through the roof opening, while cooler, fresh air entered through small gaps around the door and along the base of the walls. This pressure differential, created by the temperature difference between the heated interior and the frigid outside air, provided continuous ventilation that prevented the accumulation of deadly carbon monoxide while maintaining breathable air quality. Within the longhouse, the Langeld created distinct thermal zones that the inhabitants learned to use with tactical precision. The area immediately surrounding the fire remained the warmest, often reaching temperatures comfortable enough for people to work in light clothing, even during the depths of winter. The raised sleeping platforms that ran along both walls positioned occupants in the warmer air that naturally rose from the central hearth, while the cooler zones near the floor provided natural refrigeration for food storage. Even in the coldest areas of the longhouse, temperatures rarely dropped below freezing, creating a survivable microclimate within walls that might be surrounded by temperatures cold enough to kill an unprotected person within minutes. The fuel efficiency of this system proved critical in a landscape where every piece of combustible material had to be carefully conserved. The long, steady burn of the Langeld required less frequent feeding than multiple, smaller fires, while the thermal mass of the stone pavement meant that even small additions of fuel could provide hours of radiant heating. Within the thick turf walls of the longhouse, Norse society organised itself around the rhythms of survival and the geography of warmth. The structure was far more than a shelter. It functioned as the beating heart of the farmstead, where multiple generations of extended families lived in carefully orchestrated proximity with their livestock, servants, and occasional guests. During the long Arctic nights that stretched for months across Iceland's winter landscape, the longhouse became a complete world unto itself, where the boundaries between public and private space dissolved under the necessities of collective survival. Daily life unfolded in predictable zones that reflected both social hierarchy and thermal efficiency. The raised wooden platforms that ran along both walls of the longhouse served as multi-purpose spaces where the most important activities of Norse domestic life took place. These elevated areas, typically measuring about 3 feet in width and raised 18 inches above the central floor, functioned as beds at night, workbenches during the day, and dining surfaces during meals. Women gathered here to spin wool and weave cloth, their fingers working by firelight while children played at their feet, and men maintained weapons or carved tools from precious pieces of driftwood. The central aisle between these platforms, warmed by the Langeld and wide enough for 2 people to pass comfortably, became the highway of the household where daily traffic flowed around the sacred fire. The hearth itself occupied a position that transcended mere practicality to become the spiritual centre of Norse domestic life. Around the Langeld, families gathered not just for warmth and cooked meals, but for the telling of the stories that preserved their cultural memory across generations. Here, in the dancing light of flames that might burn continuously for months, young people learned the complex genealogies that defined their place in society, the legal precedents that governed disputes, and the practical knowledge that could mean the difference between life and death in Iceland's unforgiving environment. The fire became a sacred space where oaths were sworn, agreements were made, and the favour of the gods was invoked to protect the household through the long darkness. The transmission of building knowledge itself depended entirely on this oral tradition maintained around the winter hearth. Master craftsmen taught apprentices not through written manuals or formal schools, but through stories and demonstrations shared during the endless evenings when outdoor work became impossible. Young men learned to read the landscape for the best turf, to judge the quality of driftwood, and to lay the herringbone pattern that would keep their future families warm. Weather lore, agricultural timing, and the subtle signs that predicted storms or fair weather passed from grandfather to grandson in conversations that might stretch across weeks of winter confinement. The construction of turf longhouses required community cooperation that reinforce the social bonds essential for survival in Iceland's harsh environment. Neighbours travelled distances that might require several days of journeying to assist with major building projects, knowing that their own survival might one day depend on similar assistance. The cutting and transport of hundreds of heavy turf blocks, the gathering and placement of foundation stones, and the raising of precious timber frames demanded coordinated labour that could only be accomplished through networks of mutual obligation and shared expertise. The turf building techniques that flourished in Iceland did not emerge from a vacuum, but represented the evolution and refinement of construction methods that had spread across the North Atlantic world wherever Norse ships carried settlers into harsh, timber-poor landscapes. In the fjords of western Norway, builders had long understood the insulating power of turf roofs laid over timber halls, creating structures that could withstand the brutal Scandinavian winters while conserving precious fuel. When Viking longships pushed westward into uncharted waters during the 8th and 9th centuries, they carried not just weapons and livestock, but the accumulated building wisdom of generations who had learned to survive in the world's most challenging climates. The Norse colonization of Greenland, beginning in the late 10th century under the leadership of Eric the Red, pushed turf building techniques to their absolute limits. Here, in settlements like Brattahlid and Gardar, farmers constructed longhouses that combined massive stone foundations with turf walls that could measure up to 8 feet in thickness. These Greenlandic structures represented the ultimate refinement of Norse cold-weather engineering, designed to protect inhabitants from temperatures that regularly plunged to -30 degrees Fahrenheit and winds that could reach hurricane force. Archaeological excavations of these sites reveal sophisticated multi-room complexes where families, livestock, and precious food stores could survive for months without venturing outside, connected by covered passageways that eliminated exposure to the deadly Arctic conditions. In the Faroe Islands, Norse builders adapted their techniques to a landscape that offered abundant stone but limited timber and turf. Here, the classic herringbone turf walls gave way to structures that relied more heavily on expertly fitted stone construction, with turf used primarily for roofing and interior insulation. The result was buildings that could withstand the constant gales that swept across these isolated islands, where wind speeds regularly exceeded those of Category 1 hurricanes. Similar adaptations appeared throughout the Norse expansion zone, from the Shetland Islands to the Hebrides, where local materials and climate conditions demanded creative modifications of the core turf building principles. Within Iceland itself, the turf longhouse underwent continuous evolution throughout the medieval period. The classic Viking-era structures, with their single long halls, gradually gave way to more complex arrangements of connected buildings, each specialised for different functions. By the 13th and 14th centuries, many Icelandic farms featured clusters of smaller turf buildings arranged around central courtyards, with separate structures for different household activities, livestock housing, and food storage. The development of the badstofa, a smaller heated room used primarily during winter, reflected growing sophistication in space heating and family comfort. The most dramatic evolution came with the development of the Burstabear style that dominated Icelandic architecture from the 17th through 19th centuries. These structures retained the fundamental turf wall construction, but added wooden gable ends that allowed for more sophisticated interior layouts and better integration of chimneys and windows. Yet even as architectural fashions changed, the core principle remained constant: thick turf walls providing thermal mass and insulation that could maintain livable interior temperatures using minimal fuel. This persistence of turf construction techniques across more than 1,000 years of Icelandic history demonstrates not primitive conservatism, but the recognition of engineering solutions so perfectly adapted to their environment that improvement proved nearly impossible. The resilience of turf building techniques becomes even more remarkable when viewed alongside parallel developments in earth-sheltered construction across distant cultures that had no contact with Norse settlers. On the Great Plains of North America, European immigrants arriving in the 19th century independently rediscovered many of the same principles that had guided Viking builders 1,000 years earlier. Faced with treeless prairies and brutal winters, these settlers constructed sod houses using thick-walled earth construction that bore striking similarities to Icelandic turf longhouses. The fundamental challenge remained identical: how to create livable shelter using minimal timber in landscapes where wind and cold could kill the unprepared. Native American earth lodge traditions, particularly those developed by plains tribes like the Mandan and Hidatsa, demonstrate how different cultures arrived at remarkably similar solutions when confronted with comparable environmental challenges. These partially underground structures, built with timber frames and thick earth coverings, provided winter shelter that could maintain comfortable interior temperatures even when prairie blizzards drove outside conditions to life-threatening extremes. Like Norse turf longhouses, earth lodges relied on thermal mass, controlled ventilation, and central heating systems to create survivable microclimates within walls built from the landscape itself. The recognition that these traditional techniques contain wisdom relevant to contemporary challenges has sparked renewed interest in turf construction throughout Iceland and beyond. Modern experimental projects at sites like the Reykjavik Open Air Museum and the Viking World Museum have undertaken careful reconstructions of medieval turf longhouses using archaeological evidence and traditional knowledge to recreate structures that function as both educational tools and practical demonstrations of sustainable building principles. These reconstructions reveal that properly built turf walls can achieve insulation values that rival modern synthetic materials while using entirely renewable, locally sourced materials that require no industrial processing or long-distance transportation. Contemporary Icelandic architects and environmental designers have begun incorporating turf building principles into modern construction, creating hybrid structures that combine traditional earth-based insulation with contemporary amenities like plumbing and electricity. These projects demonstrate that the fundamental physics of thermal mass and natural insulation remain as relevant today as they were during the medieval period, offering potential solutions to modern concerns about energy efficiency and carbon emissions. Several experimental eco-villages in Scandinavia now feature modern interpretations of turf construction that maintain comfortable interior temperatures with minimal heating requirements, even during harsh Nordic winters. The growing interest in traditional building techniques reflects broader concerns about the sustainability of contemporary construction practices and the resilience of modern infrastructure in the face of climate uncertainty. As energy costs rise and concerns about grid dependence increase, the example of Norse builders who created comfortable, durable homes using nothing but local materials and human labour offers compelling alternatives to construction methods that depend on global supply chains and intensive energy consumption. The turf longhouse tradition demonstrates that sophisticated climate control and structural durability can be achieved through intelligent design and careful material selection rather than reliance on complex mechanical systems and manufactured products.